Welcome to CC Writes. My name is CC Lepke, and today we're exploring backstory. Writers love coming up with great backstory. The more tragic the character history, the better. We labor over the rich details, the powerful life events, and deep emotional impact that the backstory has on our favorite characters. But sometimes we also have a bad habit of taking things a little too far. We interrupt our own stories with details that simply aren't pertinent to the plot. We undercut the present of our story by overloading it with exposition and flashbacks that were supposed to flesh out our characters. There's a balance to be had when it comes to backstory, but it can be a difficult balance to maintain. When is the best time to include backstory? And how do we include it without going overboard? We do it through the power of dance. Because balancing your story's present action with past events is a lot like ballroom dancing. It is intentional, synchronized movement between the past and the present that gives the story emotional impact and aesthetic appeal. Today is all about the timing, venue, and steps of how to include backstory into your work. If you've ever caught yourself spending a little too much time in your story's past, or you can't quite figure out how to sprinkle in your backstory in a way that gives your writing more depth, then today is all about you, my friend. We're going to start by defining the roles of our dance partners. In ballroom dancing, the lead defines what the dance is going to look like. Similarly, your character backstory determines the steps that your character makes in the present. The follow makes the dance beautiful and fun to watch. The follow is the present action of your story. Your backstory guides, contrasts, and accentuates your story. But when all is said and done, its primary job is to make the follow, your story, look good. When I first learned ballroom dancing, one of my instructors said that the dance floor belonged to me. It was my partner's job to get out of my way and help me move in a way that made me shine. In a dance, there are certain times when the lead needs to make an appearance. There are certain venues where it's easier to dance than others, and even certain places on the dance floor itself where the lead has to guide the follow so that the follow looks good, and so nobody gets hurt. Trust me, you get your ankle stomped by one set of clunky heels on the dance floor and your whole night will be ruined. My foot was swollen for like 3 days. There are also times when the lead needs to interrupt the established steps in order to make the dance more interesting. When you're writing backstory, you should follow these ideas and these patterns established by dance in order to create a more syncopated story. Theoretically, a dance's timing is determined by the beat. Your story also has its own rhythm. I talk about that in more detail in my video series on how to write prose. But what people don't explain about dancing is that the beat is only part of what sets the rhythm of the dance. A good lead knows that a beautiful dance requires a heavy mix of rapid action, slow and graceful movement, or tension-filled stillness. And all of these things are true of backstory as well. The timing of how you use backstory matters. It defines what action takes place. It changes the speed of your work. It creates a layer of emotion that your story wouldn't otherwise possess. If you time your backstory poorly, it might throw off the action, speed, and emotion of your scenes. There are 3 major types of backstory that you can include in your story, and each one is timed a little differently. There's backstory of thought, action, and emotion, or mind, body, and soul. Backstory of the mind typically resides around psychological trauma that affects your character's thoughts. Self-doubt, self-hatred, fear of failure, inability to trust. Any backstory that affects how your character thinks about and reacts to the world around them is backstory of the mind. This type of backstory should be timed to coincide with obstacles in your story that prevent your character from moving forward toward their goal. In this way, you can increase the weight of your character's choices and their following actions. Backstory of the body, as you might expect, centers on the physical. It's all about physical weakness, a perception of weakness or trauma surrounding what happened to the body. Any genesis of a physical handicap that plagues your character fits in this category. It can be a scar, a stutter, paralysis, or any degree of bodily instability or trauma. It creates a basis for empathy and increases the perception of risk for your character. Because of this, it should be timed alongside moments of vulnerability. Backstory of the soul is unique in that it does not necessarily have to result from trauma like the other two types. It can just as easily be about happiness as it can be about pain. Tender memories, bittersweet moments, and tales of growing up are all backstories of the soul. Similarly, heartbreak, depression, and loneliness also reside here. In your story, whenever you want a moment to stretch out like a held breath, or if you want to build tension to a breaking point, it is the perfect timing for this type of backstory. But use this type of backstory with caution because it will inevitably darken the mood of your story. Now that you know when to use backstory, it's time to figure out where specifically backstory should make its appearance. Where the lead asks for a dance can make a huge impact on whether the dance will be good or not. My ballroom dancing club in college was invited to the state fair once to do a demonstration. The venue they gave us had concrete floors. By the end of the night, all of our dance shoes were ruined. A concrete venue was the worst possible place where we could dance. Similarly, there are certain places where backstory simply doesn't belong. If you get the placement of your backstory just right, it'll make your overall story shine brighter. Let's go back to the three types of backstory: mind, body, and soul. Backstory of the mind is timed along with obstacles, but the placement of it should precede those obstacles. There's a move in West Coast swing called the sugar tuck. The lead pulls their partner forward, then lifts their hand. The partner is stopped in their place before the lead pushes lightly forward, sending the partner into a spin. The sugar tuck is a setup kind of like the backstory of the mind. The backstory takes a moment to pause the momentum of the dance before sending the story into fast-paced action. If the backstory is placed without action to follow it, the pacing of the story will fall flat. Backstory of the body coincides with vulnerability, but it's one of those types that needs evidence of it sprinkled throughout the story before a final reveal is made. If your character is becoming close with someone, let them notice certain strange behavioral tics, symptoms of the ailment, or even a hint of the physical evidence at least 2 or 3 times in the story before the final reveal is made. Let the revelation come during a breaking point. Usually around the climax of action halfway through your story is a great place for this. Backstory of the soul should be used in low moments throughout the story. This includes directly after the inciting incident, just after the climax of action halfway through the story, right before going into the final battle with the antagonist, and during the final battle with the antagonist when all hope seems lost. You can sprinkle it in other places as necessary, but these are great places to either contrast or deepen feelings of loss. Ballroom dance has certain steps or patterns that have to be followed throughout every movement in order for the dance to be performed correctly. And wouldn't you know it, backstory has a few patterns of its own. Specifically, there are a few tried and true ways of how to include backstory without letting it overwhelm your story. Let's start with some practical advice. First, your backstory never needs to be as detailed as you think it does. A lot of times, the most engaging backstory is one that is never fully told. Backstory creates nuance, but it should never eclipse the present story. I realize that you love the backstory you came up with, but your story resides in the present. Give your backstory the limelight only when it is absolutely necessary to improve the story. Next, if you tell your backstory through exposition, it will kill the momentum of your story. So don't bother with it, especially when you're tempted to include some past event right at the beginning of your story to set up context. Stop yourself. You can always reveal that information in little ways later on, but it actually ruins some of the mystery you could have otherwise developed for your characters. When it's included, backstory should be used similarly to Chekhov's gun, with purpose that pushes your story forward. Never ever use your backstory as filler. It should be a revelation, the missing piece of a puzzle, an obstacle to overcome. But if you use it as something to boost your word count, then you're doing a disservice to your story. As a general rule, if your story makes as much sense without that backstory, then it wasn't needed in the first place. So, in order to avoid these pitfalls, let's talk about ways to actually include the backstory. I like to use memory, dialogue, and the environment as vehicles for backstory. I use memory sort of like a PTSD flashback. A smell, an image, or a sound will bring something back to the forefront of your character's mind. In real life, we don't often get trapped in vivid memories of the past unless we actually do suffer from PTSD. Most of the time, the thing that makes us recall the memory will bring an emotion along with it. It will have us looking around expecting a lost loved one to walk into the room to greet us. It is brief, emotional, and rarely do we spend time thinking about all the things that surround that memory. Write memories like your character is haunted by a ghost. They should only see flashes of it in tattered fragments. Again, unless your character suffers from PTSD, in which case, go wild, my friend. Backstory and dialogue should be even more brief. It should be revealed through a childhood nickname followed by a single sentence about how they got that nickname. It could be a tentative question that hints at a darker meaning. It should be a short, halting explanation that doesn't reveal too much. Mostly, you should avoid using a monologue to tell backstory. On extremely rare occasions, you can use a monologue. Extremely rare, like almost never. For the most part, try to follow the advice of One Punch Man and keep the backstory and dialogue to 20 words or less. Environment is a really fun way to introduce backstory. Your character can imagine the environment how it used to be and then briefly muse on the thing that changed. There could be an object, a torn facade, or strange geography that your character notices and is later revealed to be more important than it was originally assumed. The backstory can be guessed at and then later revealed to be correct or completely incorrect. Whichever route you take, not only does the environment help facilitate backstory, but it also creates a more vibrant world for your story, which makes it totally worth it. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list of when, where, and how to use backstory, but it's a great place to get started and get used to including backstory with a little bit more balance. In dance, both partners are meant to counterweight one another so that it's easy to communicate what move comes next and keep both partners in balance with each other. We call it the connection. Partners with a good connection will be able to move smoothly at the lightest touch. The connection between your backstory and your story's present needs to be light while still communicating a lot. If you keep my advice in mind, you should be able to keep your writing in balance with a backstory that accentuates the beauty of the story that you created. If you liked my advice on how to write more balanced backstory and want to see more from me about how to write, check out the video on top. Otherwise, click on the bottom video to see what YouTube recommends. As always, thank you so much for joining me today on CC Writes. I hope you enjoyed our time together, and I will see you later.